Of course, the way you get customers to use open banking powered services is by giving them services they want to use, and things that do things differently and things that do things better. So I'm really excited to see. I really want to have this conversation this time next year because I want to see that kind of like growth chart, go straight up now.
Yeah, for sure.
So this week, first story we have over on Finextra. It is Open Banking surpasses 1 million customers. So on the second anniversary of Open Banking in the UK, new figures show that the number of users has doubled in the past 6 months. Third-party service providers have also doubled, which might account for the numbers change, I guess. In 2018, there was about 100. Now there are over 200, fielding about 200 million monthly requests. So this is good news, right? Everything that's been sort of going on and all the work that the CMA9 have been doing, good news story, Sarah?
Yeah, I had a bit of a dig into this. So I actually wrote a blog post on the 2-year anniversary of Open Banking, and I went back and sort of had a look into some of the OBIE's figures. That 1 million user figure is actually just CMA9 customers, which is interesting. It doesn't specify whether that's people who are actually using open banking or people who have signed up to open banking powered services through the CMA9 but may or may not also be using screen scraping. So there's a little bit of an interesting figure. Also, 1 million isn't actually that high in 2 years when you consider how many people use those banking apps. So in my mind, it's a good sign, but I think things are really actually going to take off this year. I think what we've seen in the last 2 years is that the infrastructure players have done really, really well. The True Layers of this world, the Tinks of this world, we'll get onto them a bit later. Plaid actually arguably isn't really in the UK yet, but it is playing very much in the same space. And those guys have done incredibly well, and they needed to get the infrastructure in place for us to now start seeing some of the innovative services on top. I would say that the CMA9 have actually quite struggled in the last 2 years. I think it's been quite painful for them. I think they've sort of suddenly started to realise that perhaps the best way to do this is with the help of those third-party players. And I think that now they've had that realisation, now those third-party players have really found their feet, and people like Visa are on board as well. I think we're really going to start seeing more innovation this year. And of course, the way you get customers to use open banking powered services is by giving them services they want to use, and things that do things differently and things that do things better. So I'm really excited to see. I really want to have this conversation this time next year because I want to see that kind of like growth chart, go straight up now.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's interesting because last year, if we rewind 12 months, the conversation was quite critical on open banking. Like, it hasn't really had the effect that we wanted. Is it going to be successful? And I found it all quite odd because the APIs, they're the plug-in cable between two different pieces of software to talk together and share data, but you have to build the APIs first in order for another company to then build on top of them. Just by virtue of them launching doesn't mean that automatically they'll be able to be used. But also there was quite a few delays with the implementation of them. So there's a number of delays. Once you build the API, then the companies are able to build on top of them, build new business models. There was also criticism saying most people don't know what open banking is. I'm like, well, of course, people don't know what APIs are, but
it doesn't matter, actually. Yeah. I think that's completely asking the wrong question.
Yeah, 100%, because people care about the utility of the service. They care about having things delivered to them better, faster, more seamlessly, and then they'll appreciate it, but they're not going to think of like, oh, what a beautiful API implementation between,
I mean, around here we have conversations like that, but we're not exactly normal. So.
Yeah, but our parents and, the wider world, just kind of like the average person out there not working in this industry. But I think it's a really good sign. I do think that what we'll see next is as this continues to evolve, I think particularly as the authorization flows improve between the banks and third parties, and that's something I know OBIE has been really pushing, I think that will only increase and motivate even more players to look for new and additional services that they can provide. So yeah, it's a good start, but I think it's, like you say, it'll probably really take off this year and probably over next as well.
What do you think? Have you seen, of the people knocking on the door for money, have they, has the open banking sense of that sort of really sort of increased?
There's been quite a lot over the last few years, although, what I'd say is this, right? It's good that number's going up and not going down and not sort of staying flat. But it doesn't mean a huge amount to me, I think, right? It's kind of like saying, hey, we've written 1 million lines of code, right? Like, great. What does it do? I think as Megan says, like lots of the infrastructure is kind of being built out, and you need that to be in place before you can do stuff that's truly valuable to consumers and to customers. Good that like it's kind of happening, but there must be a better measure out there somewhere of quality of implementation, I guess. But it's quite a hard thing to actually quantify.
I mean, if people want more stats, then the OBIE does publish things like the number of successful calls, the rate, the number of calls that are made, the number of calls that are successful, and they publish that for the CMA9 since open banking was implemented. So if you're like me and you love the numbers behind it, then you can go and find that. The OBIE is quite open. What I would like to see, though, is outside of the CMA9. So how many are Starling handling? How many are, Monzo is just about starting to play in this space. What's it handling? What's it doing? Those kind of things would be really interesting as well.
Well, I mean, shortly after this news broke, YouGov released a report, didn't they, talking about, it seemed like a slightly oddly positioned one, where it said only 8% of people in Britain are actually using digital-only banks like Monzo and Starling. So, I mean, that either they're using it a lot and therefore accounting for an over-indexing on the 200 million calls that have kind of been done, or actually the spread's actually quite wide in terms of the impact from the usage perspective.
Yeah, I mean, so I have a thing about surveys, and I think I'm a researcher. So if you're going to ask a question, ask the question accurately. And the question that was asked,
I thought I'd set you off. On that one,
the question that was asked was, how do you manage your money?
Yeah.
That's not, do you use a challenger bank? That's, how do you manage your money? So I would actually argue that 8% stat is probably 8% of people who solely use Monzo or Starling. And there aren't many people in this country who only use one bank, whatever bank that is, or even, only one bank and one credit card provider. So I think that's a slightly misleading stat. I think the 204 third-party service providers fielding 200 million monthly requests, that number feels very low. So if you've got 9 banks fielding, with 1 million customers, and then you've got 204 third parties only fielding 200 million requests. That to me says quite a lot about the quality of the APIs that are out there, and also the quantity to a certain extent. But a lot of the third parties that you were mentioning, Z, that kind of want the money. They built their business models on the premise that they could use the APIs that the banks were being forced to build. And actually, as Megan pointed out, that hasn't actually been possible for much of the last 2 years because they just haven't been high enough quality. So that's impacted not only those third parties' abilities to succeed, but also the ability of their customers to use open banking. Because if the third party can't provide them the service that they're promising, then the customers are either not going to come or they're going to leave. So that's something that I really want to see improve in the next year, is that those third parties can rely on the APIs from the banks and from whoever they're pulling them from, actually, in order to deliver their customers a better service.
Yeah, I mean, even last week, after the whole sort of Plaid thing, I think I read somewhere that even Plaid, they only have successful calls 80% of the time or something like that.
Yeah, and that's like losing 1 in 10 of your emails or something.
Right.
It's the stats are kind of like, somebody phrased it to me that if your uptime is 94% of your calls are successful, that's like losing 1 in 25 emails.
Yeah.
So if it's anything less than that.
This was really fascinating, though, because this YouGov research was also tied into a FinExtra article that I read yesterday that was, you might have seen this. It was incredibly frustrating because it goes in and it says, it looks like only 8% are using the new challengers. It's actually the incumbents that are benefiting from mobile banking because most people who are accessing mobile banking are using an incumbent. But I'm like, when they say digital challengers like Starling and Monzo have 8% of the market, both Starling and Monzo have been open about their customer numbers. And it's I think Monzo's last report was around 3 million. Starling is 1 million. You have 48 million adults in the UK. That's 8.3%. So, you know what I mean? Obviously, it's not like Starling and Monzo. What other
Starling plus Monzo.
digital-only retail, fully licensed banks could have actually got into that?
The likelihood of people thinking, oh, well, I use Revolut or I use Monies or I use Pocket, they don't count them as challengers. Yeah,
but then also, to be fair, so Starling launched as a bank first, but that was May 2017. So in less than 3 years, the challengers have 8% of the market, which, to your point, most people don't just use one bank. Lots of people have multiple bank accounts. So it's still a bit of a skewed view. But also, I do think it was a bit too far to say it's only been partially successful. The incumbents are really benefiting from mobile banking because Starling and Monzo only have 8% of the market. It's a little glass half empty.
Only 8%. Yeah.
But also, people aren't using Monzo for open banking as well. It was a very strange, slightly tenuous link. I can understand it slightly more with Starling, but I don't think most people who pick Starling as a provider or switch entirely to Starling have done so because of the marketplace. I think it's a value add, but I don't think that's their primary driver.
I completely agree with that, Megan. It's, I've said this, I think, on the podcast before, but it's 30 years for First Direct to get to 1 million customers. It took 3 years to get to where we're at. That is whether you sort of count them as fully fledged customers and all the vibes, or whether it really means the same thing. That change in the market is exponential, isn't it? But, what do you think? I mean, is it because companies are not providing the right services, or is it just the point that we're at in the cycle?
I don't think so, because over Christmas I converted my parents onto Starling with a joint bank account, and they are so happy with it. They think it's amazing versus their old-fashioned bank. So I don't think so. I think it's just going to take time for them to grow. And I think the integration point that you made is exactly right, because I am a Starling customer, and I've used 3 of the integrations, and they're always quite clunky, and it's not always Starling's fault, because at some point, for example, I used their Habito mortgage integration. At some point, the use case was that Habito had to telephone me, and that's because of the regs. So there's nothing really Starling or Habito could have done about that. So I think making all of that a bit more seamless will drive adoption of it. And then also in my world, which is more on the investment side, there's this big drive for open investments, open finances in general. And when data starts to get much more complex about, it's not just your cash balances, but we're also now exchanging what are your savings, what's your debt, the APIs and all of that reg process needs to get way, way smoother for it to work seamlessly.
I mean, on that, integration is somewhat of a broad church, as you say. I mean, I remember you saying a lot, Megan, before, it's different people at Starling are integrated in very different ways, aren't they? Yeah. Somebody like Flux is integrated in a very different way than somebody like Habito, as you say. So
yeah, absolutely. So there's a variety of integrations. Some where they're deeply integrated into the app, accessing like end to end within Starling, or other applications, just APIs. Generally, you can have a deep integration, or you can have those where it's purely accessed externally. So someone like Tail, which is similar to Flux, where they're giving you loyalty and rewards cash back, but it's completely external to the application. They're just purely pulling information from one app externally. Then you have others who are sharing data in. It's a two-way data flow. But there's multiple different types. So it's actually, it's a bit more nuanced than it looks like on the surface.
Absolutely. All right. Well, this one's going to, this time next year, Sarah, where will we be?
Oh, I'll be back writing another blog post, I'm sure. Where we'd like us to be is for us to be able to talk about all the exciting services that have taken off and actually done good, useful, interesting things for people and ideally businesses as well.
All right. Well, let's come back in next year then, eh?